You can know the Bible's true because of the veracity of the documents. Veracity, habitual truthfulness of the documents. Let's think about Luke as an author. Luke the historian. Luke was the travel companion of Paul. He wrote a gospel called... Okay, glad to know you guys didn't fall asleep for the first point. And he wrote another book as a companion, the book of... Very good. So let's take a look at what Luke wrote in Luke chapter 1. He writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So Luke tells us what his purpose is for writing this gospel. So how many of you like watching game shows on television? It's okay. You know, you can... There's one hand in back. Okay. Well, maybe that's good. All right. Well, there's when I was a kid, I liked watching Wheel of Fortune. And there was one theme within the set of games, rounds, and it was person, place, or... Okay, so you guys do watch the game show. Okay. Person, place, or thing. Well, think about Luke. When you think about Luke, think about Wheel of Fortune, okay? Instead of person, place, or thing, person or persons, people, places, and events. Okay, Luke is the historian, people, places, and events. So Luke was a physician by trade, but as an investigator of these events, he talked to eyewitnesses. He provides historical references, historical reference markers, and this increases the credibility of his writing. Consider this. Luke documents certain people like Pontius Pilate, Herod the Great, Sergio Paulus, Gallic, Felix, Caiaphas, Ananias, and Gamaliel, and more. Luke's uses of titles for these people is astoundingly accurate. Acts 13:7, Sergio Paulus as proconsul. Acts 16:18, archon. Acts 16:35, praetors and lictors, for whom people today we would call magistrates or an officer. Finally, in his gospel, he refers to Herod Antipas as tetrarch. This is all accurate for these people. Let's consider the places. I won't list them all because there's a lot, but Luke lists 32 countries, 54 cities, and even 9 islands without a single mistake. And if you're making something up, you'd also add things, right? You maybe add places that don't exist, like a work of fiction. For example, the Book of Mormon. Not a single historical marker from what the Book of Mormon claims about those ancient tribes has been discovered from archaeology or verified, corroborated. Contrast that with Luke. It's like night and day. Finally, the events. Luke talks about events that happen. So, of course, he talks about events that happens, but events from like Roman history. So, for example, the Jews were expelled from Rome, if you look carefully in Acts 18:2. This event is also detailed by the ancient historian Suetonius in his work, Lives of the 12 Caesars, who he wrote, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Suetonius published that work in 121 AD. Luke's Acts of the Apostles is likely to have been written prior to 70 AD. Some scholars present an argument for after 70, but certainly before 80. But this makes Luke's reference to this historical event earlier than the Roman historian Suetonius. With regard to the historical claims of people, places, and events, Luke does not make a single mistake. Time and time again, Luke shows himself to be a reliable source and a fine historian whom we can trust. So that's Luke the historian. Think about Paul as a person from the early church. Paul's letters, which were written before the Gospels were composed. Paul's letters, the letters that Paul wrote to different churches, frequently describing their troubles. He wouldn't have written a letter to you guys because, no troubles here, of course. So these letters include not only aspects of truthfulness, but the earliest Christian creeds. For example, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 is perhaps the earliest Christian creed in existence. And in verses 3-4, he explains, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures." Why is this important for us? Because if this is the earliest Christian creed, as some scholars, even non-Christian scholars, grant, it demonstrates for us what the earliest Christians thought. Even if you thought it weren't true, okay, that Jesus rose from the dead, as a sort of sociological analysis, this is what the Christians believed. So this demonstrates that the beliefs of the early church shows they actually believe Jesus physically rose from the dead. This is not a later embellishment, as some people might think. Paul's letters have the hallmarks of first century letter writing, and they contain genuine, authentic content, which would not have been included if they were made up. So, for example, in Galatians 6:11, Paul says, "See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand." Well, why would he write such a thing? Well, because in ancient letter writing, you frequently had a secretary or a scribe write the letter. You would recite what you wanted to say. So Paul is letting his audience here know that he is personally writing this letter. And he perhaps struggled with trouble with eyesight later in his life because he wrote with large letters. Consider also 1 Corinthians 5:11. "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that's not tolerated, even among pagans, for a man has his father's wife." If you're trying to convince people to join your social club or your religious cult even, that's not exactly something you'd say, hey, you don't put that on the marketing, right? And so it demonstrates the authenticity of the document, the truthfulness of the document. So even theologically liberal scholars, I don't speak politically, but theologically liberal, people who cast doubt on the authenticity of the documents, they still grant that Paul wrote Galatians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, whereas the pastorals, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are believed to be pseudepigraphal. Someone else wrote those. That's not my position, but that's what they think. But they grant that even these epistles of Paul's are genuine, authentic, and they are early to the time of the Christian church. Finally, let's look at embarrassing details in terms of the veracity of the documents. Well, embarrassing details are important because if you want to prop up a fairy tale, a fiction, you don't include embarrassing details, one of which we just talked about from Paul's letters, but let's look at the Gospels. First, Jesus' family didn't believe that he was the Messiah. John the Baptist doubted that Jesus was the Messiah. The disciples also doubted. Women were the first to discover the empty tomb, which you wouldn't have written if you were making something up. So in the first century, women's testimony was sought with skepticism and frequently thrown out in a court of law. So you wouldn't have women discovering the tomb if you wanted to prove that the tomb was empty. You would have written that men discovered the empty tomb. Finally, Peter is called the Satan, right? In Mark 8, Jesus says that of Peter, the leader of the church. Oh, if you wanted people to join your church, your social club, why would you have the leader being accused of being Satan? It's just an embarrassing detail that, again, adds to the authenticity. Okay, so that's the veracity of the documents.